13-year-old Maya Foster bounded down the familiar path of Westbrook Park. The sky was a brilliant shade of blue, and the sunlight danced through the leaves, casting playful shadows on the ground. It was the kind of day that made everything feel alive, with the sense of earth and fresh grass filling the air. For Maya, the park wasn't just a place to play or explore. It was where she felt close to her father, Captain David Foster. He often patrolled this park, ensuring it was safe for everyone. Today, Maya wanted to surprise him. She had told him she was going to meet a friend, but she'd secretly planned this trip to the park, hoping to see him in action. She was proud of him, of the way he kept their community safe. He was her hero. As Maya wandered deeper into the park, she took in the familiar sights. Families gathered for picnics, children laughing as they played on the swings, and couples strolling hand in hand along the trails. She felt a warm glow of contentment as she watched everyone enjoying themselves. Here, surrounded by laughter and sunshine, she felt completely at home. But as she veered onto a quieter path, away from the crowds, the atmosphere shifted. The sounds of laughter and chatter faded, leaving an almost eerie silence. She paused, glancing around. It was a section of the park she rarely visited, with thick trees creating pockets of shadow along the trail. Suddenly, Maya noticed a figure up ahead. A police officer standing near a bench, arms crossed. He was tall, with a stony expression and a hard look in his eyes. She didn't recognize him, but she assumed he must be one of her father's colleagues. Perhaps he'd seen her before with her father. She slowed her steps, feeling a flicker of uncertainty. Should she say hello, or just walk past him? Her father had always taught her to be respectful to officers, but something about this man's gaze made her feel uneasy. As she drew closer, he straightened, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on her. She noticed how his expression didn't soften. Instead, he seemed to watch her with a strange intensity, as though sizing her up. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked sharply, his tone cold. Maya felt her throat tighten. I'm just here to meet my dad," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "He's on duty today, patrolling the park." The officer raised an eyebrow, a smirk twisting his mouth. "Oh, really?" he sneered. His gaze drifted over her, lingering in a way that made her feel small and vulnerable. "You think you're special because of that? Think the rules don't apply to you?" Maya's stomach nodded. She didn't understand why he was speaking to her like this. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she murmured, glancing down at her shoes. He took a step closer, his smirk growing more pronounced. "Kids like you," he muttered, his voice laced with contempt, "always thinking the world revolves around you, like you own the place." His hand reached out suddenly, gripping her arm tightly. The force of it surprised her, and she winced as his fingers dug into her skin. I'm sorry if I upset you," she managed, her voice shaking. She looked around, hoping to see someone nearby, someone who might notice what was happening. But the path was deserted, the peaceful silence now feeling suffocating. The officer's expression didn't change. If anything, his grip tightened, and his gaze grew colder. "Think you can just walk wherever you please, hmm?" His voice was low, almost a growl. "Well, I have news for you, princess. You're not going anywhere until I say you can." Fear surged through Maya as she struggled to pull her arm free, but his hold was unyielding. She didn't understand why this was happening or what she had done to make him so angry. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she fought them back, determined not to show weakness. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I just want to see my dad." The officer laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that sent a chill down her spine. "Oh, now you want to see Daddy, do you?" His grip on her arm tightened even further, and she gasped in pain. Her heart pounded as she looked up at him, desperately hoping he'd let her go. But his eyes gleamed with a cold satisfaction, and she realized, with a sinking feeling, that he had no intention of releasing her. She took a shaky breath, trying to gather her thoughts, to figure out what to do. Her father had taught her to stay calm in difficult situations, to think clearly. But right now, all she could feel was fear and confusion. "Open your mouth," he ordered suddenly, his voice hard. Maya's eyes widened. "W what?" she stammered, unable to comprehend his command. He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. I said, "Open your mouth," he repeated, his tone low and menacing. Or are you too good to listen to orders? Maya shook her head, feeling her body tremble. She wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to get away from this nightmare. But she was frozen, paralyzed by his grip and his unrelenting gaze. "What's the matter?" he sneered, watching her with a twisted smile. "Not so tough now, are you?" She felt tears spill down her cheeks, a helplessness washing over her that she had never felt before. She wanted to fight back, to scream for help, but the words were trapped in her throat, choked by her fear. "You're pathetic," he spat, releasing her arm with a shove that sent her stumbling backward. She caught herself, breathing heavily, her whole body shaking. He watched her, his expression full of contempt. "Run along now," he said, his voice mocking. "Go cry to Daddy." With a final, hateful glare, he turned and walked away, leaving Maya standing alone, trembling. She could still feel the imprint of his hand on her arm, the bruising grip that had left her feeling broken and vulnerable. As she stood there, catching her breath, a wave of anger surged through her. She didn't understand why he had treated her like that, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't let him get away with it. Summoning the last of her strength, she turned and ran back toward the heart of the park, her mind set on finding her father and telling him everything. The fear still clung to her, but beneath it, a fierce determination began to grow. She knew her father would stand by her, that he would help her find justice. As she spotted him in the distance, his familiar silhouette patrolling along a path, she felt a surge of relief. "Dad!" she called, her voice cracking with emotion. He turned, his face concerned as he saw her running toward him, tears streaming down her face. "Maya?" he asked, his tone full of worry as he wrapped his arms around her. "What happened?" She took a shaky breath, clinging to him as she whispered, "Dad, you won't believe what he did to me." Maya collapsed into her father's arms, her small frame shaking as she clung to him. The warmth and strength in his embrace were like a shield, protecting her from the storm of emotions raging inside her. She could barely get her words out, her voice a broken whisper as she recounted what had happened. "Dad, there was this officer," she choked out, her words tumbling over one another. "He grabbed me. He said awful things. He wouldn't let me go." Captain David Foster's face darkened, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed her words. Every detail seemed to twist his expression into one of barely controlled rage. He held her close, gently stroking her hair as he whispered, "I'm here now, Maya. You're safe. No one will hurt you." But beneath his calm tone, she could sense a storm brewing. She looked up, meeting his intense gaze, and saw that his jaw was clenched, his shoulders tense. "Who was this man?" he asked, his voice controlled but low, almost a growl. "Do you remember his name?" Maya shook her head, her mind still reeling. I don't know. He was tall, had dark hair, and he kept sneering at me. He was wearing a police uniform, but he didn't act like any officer I've ever met." David's eyes hardened as he processed her words. He looked around the park, scanning for any sign of the man she had described. He reached for his radio, his fingers steady and precise. "This is Captain Foster," he spoke into the radio, his voice low and firm, requesting immediate backup at Westbrook Park. "Possible case of officer misconduct. This is urgent." Within minutes, officers began arriving, their presence a reassurance to Maya. Among them was Detective Linda Carter, a calm, experienced investigator known for her thoroughness. David explained the situation to her in a few brief sentences, and Linda immediately knelt down to Maya's eye level, her expression gentle and kind. "Maya," Linda said softly, "I know this is difficult, but can you tell me what happened? Anything you can remember will help us find this man." Maya took a shaky breath, her gaze flickering between her father and the detective. Her father gave her a reassuring nod, his hand resting on her shoulder. She looked back at Linda, trying to steady her voice. "I was just walking through the park," she began, her words coming slowly, as if each one weighed her down. "I saw him standing by the bench, and I thought he might know my dad. But when I got close, he looked at me in a strange way. She recounted the encounter as best as she could, the hateful words, the way he'd grabbed her arm, the mocking tone in his voice. Linda listened intently, her eyes never leaving Maya's. When Maya finished, Linda placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing coming to your dad," Linda said gently. "I promise we'll do everything we can to find him and make sure he answers for what he's done." As Maya looked around, she noticed a small crowd had started to gather nearby. Their murmurs of shock and sympathy made her feel exposed, as if the fear she felt was painted across her face for everyone to see. She shifted closer to her father, who sensed her discomfort and gently guided her toward a quieter area, away from the crowd. "We'll take it from here," Linda assured David, giving Maya a supportive smile. "Go home, rest. We'll follow up soon." David nodded, a fierce determination in his eyes. He placed his arm protectively around Maya's shoulders, leading her away from the scene. As they walked, Maya felt the weight of the day pressing down on her. She could still feel the officer's grip on her arm, the way his words had sliced through her confidence, leaving her raw and vulnerable. The silence between her and her father was heavy, each step echoing the unspoken anger that radiated from him. But as they reached their car, he stopped, turning to face her. He knelt down so that their eyes were level, his gaze filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "Maya," he said, his voice gentle yet firm, "I promise you this. I will make sure he faces justice. No one has the right to treat you that way. You're safe with me, and I'll do everything in my power to protect you." Maya nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She wanted to believe him, to feel as safe as he wanted her to be. But the memory of the officer's cruel smile lingered in her mind, casting a shadow over her sense of security. That evening, as they sat at home, Maya's mother, Sarah, joined them, her face pale as David explained what had happened. Sarah hugged Maya tightly, her own emotions barely contained as she held her daughter. The comfort of her mother's embrace was a balm to Maya, and for the first time since the encounter, she felt a faint sense of calm. Later, as they ate dinner in a silence broken only by the clinking of cutlery, David's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw it was Linda. "Captain Foster," Linda's voice came through the line, steady but carrying a hint of frustration. "We're running into some resistance from the department. The officer in question, Turner, has been with us for years, and, well, the union is pushing back, saying we need more evidence before we pursue any serious action." David's jaw tightened. "More evidence?" he echoed, a note of disbelief in his voice. "My daughter's testimony should be enough to investigate." "I understand," Linda replied, her tone sympathetic, "but you know how it is. It's going to take more than one complaint to bring him in. The union is saying it's just her word against his." David exhaled slowly, his frustration simmering. He glanced at Maya, who was watching him, her eyes wide with worry. He forced a reassuring smile, nodding at her before returning to his conversation with Linda. "We won't let this go," he said firmly. "Turner will face justice. I won't let him hurt anyone else." After he hung up, David looked at Maya, his expression a mix of anger and sadness. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "We're going to fight this," he told her. "We're going to make sure they hear your story. This isn't over, not by a long shot." Maya managed a small nod, feeling the strength in her father's grip. Despite the fear that still lingered within her, a spark of hope began to take root. She wasn't alone in this. She had her father by her side, and she knew that he would do whatever it took to protect her. As she lay in bed that night, Maya's thoughts drifted back to the officer's cold, mocking face, and a shiver ran through her. She hugged her blanket close, the weight of the day settling over her. But in the darkness, she also felt a faint glimmer of courage. They were going to fight this, together. Captain David Foster's determination burned stronger with each passing day. The events at the park haunted him, replaying in his mind, stirring an anger he hadn't felt in years. Knowing his daughter, Maya, had been humiliated, intimidated, and hurt by someone in the same uniform he wore was a betrayal of everything he believed in. The morning after the incident, David sat with Maya in the living room, going over what would happen next. He explained that they'd file a formal complaint against Officer Turner with Internal Affairs, IA, and that Maya might need to recount her story again. He could see the unease in her eyes, but he gave her an encouraging nod. "I'll be with you every step of the way," he promised. Maya nodded, clutching her hands together tightly. "I want to do this, Dad," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I want to make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else." At the police station, David's fellow officers greeted him with a mix of sympathy and curiosity. Many of them knew about the incident, and whispers followed him as he made his way to the Internal Affairs office. Linda Carter was waiting for them with a calm but determined expression, ready to assist them through the process. "Thank you for coming, Maya," Linda said gently, guiding them to a quiet room. She could see the nervousness in Maya's eyes and did her best to set her at ease. "I know this isn't easy, but your courage will make a difference." Maya took a deep breath and began telling her story once again. This time, with her father sitting beside her, she spoke with a renewed strength, describing every detail she could remember. Linda took notes, listening intently and nodding with encouragement. David's heart ached with every word, but he kept his expression steady, knowing that his strength would be her anchor. When Maya finished, Linda assured them that they'd launch a full investigation. But David noticed a hesitation in her expression, a flicker of frustration that she couldn't quite mask. "What is it, Linda?" he asked, his tone wary. Linda hesitated before she answered. "The department's union has been informed, and there's already some resistance. Officer Turner has been with us for nearly a decade, and, well, they're saying we need solid evidence before we take any action." David's fist clenched. "So my daughter's word isn't enough?" "It's not that," Linda replied, sighing. "But you know how this goes. Turner has connections in the department, and the union will fight hard to protect him. They're saying it's her word against his." David's jaw tightened as he forced himself to remain calm. He looked at Maya, who was watching them both with worried eyes. He softened his expression, determined not to let her see his frustration. "Thank you, Linda. We'll be back if you need anything else." Back home, David tried to keep the mood light, but it was impossible to ignore the tension that simmered beneath the surface. The next day, a local reporter named Sophie Grant reached out to him. She had heard about the complaint and wanted to interview Maya to bring more attention to her story. David was hesitant. The last thing he wanted was to drag Maya through the details again, especially not in front of the public. But when he explained the idea to her, Maya surprised him. "I want to do it, Dad," she said quietly. "If people hear what happened, maybe they'll understand. Maybe they'll see that this isn't right." He looked at her, seeing a new strength in her eyes, one that both filled him with pride and broke his heart. "All right," he said gently, "but only if you're sure." The interview was scheduled for the following afternoon. David and Maya arrived at the local news station, where Sophie met them at the front desk. She was a kind-looking woman in her mid-30s, with a steady, empathetic presence that put Maya at ease. She led them to a quiet studio, where they sat down across from each other under the bright lights. "Thank you for being here, Maya," Sophie said warmly. "I know it's not easy, but your story could help a lot of people." Maya nodded, casting a glance at her father for reassurance. He gave her a small, encouraging smile, and she took a deep breath, steeling herself. As the cameras rolled, Sophie asked Maya about the incident. Maya's voice was steady but quiet as she described what had happened, recounting the officer's cold words, the way he'd grabbed her, the fear that had gripped her in those terrible moments. She fought back tears as she spoke, determined to finish her story, but her voice trembled with each painful memory. When the interview aired later that evening, the response was swift and fierce. Social media exploded with comments and shares, people expressing outrage, sympathy, and disbelief. Hashtag Justice for Maya began trending locally, and people in the community rallied behind her, demanding accountability and change. But as the story gained traction, backlash surfaced as well. Some doubted her account, calling her a spoiled teenager seeking attention. Others dismissed it as a misunderstanding, saying she must have misinterpreted the officer's actions. David's heart sank as he read the comments, angered by the cruel words directed at his daughter. But Maya, though hurt, kept her head high, refusing to let the negativity bring her down. As the week went on, David and Maya faced mounting resistance from within the department. The police union was openly defending Turner, insisting that his actions had been misconstrued and that Maya's account was exaggerated. David could feel the growing tension among his colleagues, some of whom were beginning to treat him with a cold indifference. One evening, as David reviewed documents and emails related to the case, he received a call from Linda. "David," she began, her tone weary but resolute, "we've come across a few complaints about Turner from years ago. They were small, things that were dismissed back then as misunderstandings or minor conflicts. But looking at them now, it's clear there's a pattern." David's grip tightened on the phone. Why wasn't he investigated before? Each complaint was handled separately, and nothing ever escalated to this level, Linda explained. But now that we're seeing the big picture, we can't ignore it. Turner's conduct has been questionable for years. David's heart pounded with a mixture of relief and anger. "So you're saying we have a case?" "Yes," Linda replied, her tone firm. "It won't be easy. The union is going to fight back hard. But we finally have enough to launch a formal investigation. We're not backing down." After ending the call, David sat in silence, his mind racing. He looked over at Maya, who was curled up on the couch, watching him with a hint of hope in her eyes. He nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. "They're going to investigate Turner," he said, his voice filled with a determination he hadn't felt in days. "This is just the beginning, Maya. They're going to hear us." The days that followed were filled with meetings, phone calls, and mounting tension. David spoke with community leaders, organizing small gatherings to discuss the case and raise awareness. People in the community were growing increasingly vocal, demanding justice for Maya and accountability for Turner. David spoke passionately at each gathering, describing the pain his daughter had endured and calling for systemic change. Maya stood by his side at every event, her presence a reminder of the courage and resilience that had sparked the movement. She found herself speaking up as well, sharing her story with a quiet but steady determination. Each time she told her story, she felt a little stronger, her voice growing steadier with each word. In the midst of all the noise, Maya found moments of calm with her family. They spent quiet evenings together, her mother offering gentle words of encouragement, her father holding her hand, their bond strengthening as they fought this battle together. Maya's fear began to fade, replaced by a newfound resolve. She wasn't just telling her story, she was fighting for something bigger, something that went beyond her own pain. And as the community rallied around her, she knew that they were only just beginning. As Maya's story spread across the town, the response was overwhelming. Within days, local media channels and social media platforms were filled with reactions, messages of support, and demands for accountability. People began to rally behind Maya, inspired by her bravery in standing up against someone in a position of power. The hashtag Justice for Maya trended, quickly turning into a movement for police reform and justice. But the growing attention also brought out doubters. Some questioned the credibility of Maya's account, while others tried to defend Officer Turner, saying he was simply doing his job. A few even claimed that Maya's father, Captain David Foster, was exaggerating the incident because of his personal ties to the case. David, used to standing strong under pressure, found himself struggling as his family faced public scrutiny. But he remained resolute, determined to see justice for Maya no matter the obstacles. One evening, David and Maya sat together at their dining room table, scrolling through the latest news articles and social media posts. Their faces were lit by the glow of their screens as they read the comments flooding in. "Look, Dad," Maya whispered, her voice filled with awe as she showed him her phone. It was a post from a young woman who had experienced similar harassment. She says reading my story gave her the courage to finally speak up. David's heart swelled with pride as he looked at her. "Maya, do you realize how much courage it takes to share what you went through? You're helping others find their voices too." Maya nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and disbelief. But the supportive comments were balanced by cruel, dismissive ones. As she scrolled further, her heart sank when she came across a post that read, "This whole story is overblown. She's probably making it up for attention." David noticed her expression darken. He placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, squeezing it gently. "Don't let them get to you," he said. "The people who matter, the ones who truly care about justice, are standing with us." Maya tried to smile, but the words weighed on her. She knew that not everyone would believe her, but seeing it so blatantly written hurt more than she expected. She took a deep breath, letting her father's reassurance sink in. A few days later, Maya and her family attended a rally organized in her support. Community members, activists, and local leaders gathered at the town square, holding signs that read "Justice for Maya," "No more abuse of power," and "Accountability now." The air buzzed with energy, voices rising in solidarity as one speaker after another took the stage. One by one, people from the community came forward to speak. Some shared their own stories of mistreatment, while others voiced their support for Maya and her family. Listening to each person's words, Maya felt a strange mixture of sadness and strength. She was heartbroken to realize how many others had experienced similar pain. Yet she felt empowered knowing she wasn't alone. When her father gently encouraged her to speak, Maya's hands shook, but she took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. Her heart pounded as she looked out over the crowd, their faces expectant and supportive. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice soft but growing stronger as she spoke. "This has been the hardest thing I've ever gone through, and I know I'm not the only one. No one should have to feel powerless, especially in the face of someone who's supposed to protect them. I'm standing here today because I believe we can make a difference. We can change things so no one else has to experience this." The crowd erupted in applause, and Maya felt a surge of pride and relief. As she stepped back, her father wrapped an arm around her, his eyes shining with pride. As the movement gained momentum, the police department faced mounting pressure. Officials were called to answer questions from reporters, and the mayor's office released a statement promising an internal review of the incident and the conduct of Officer Turner. But behind the scenes, David knew there was still resistance. One morning, as David was preparing to leave for work, he received a call from Linda Carter. Her voice was tense, almost apologetic. "David, I wanted to give you a heads up," she said. "The police union is pushing back hard. They're insisting Turner was just doing his job, and that your daughter misinterpreted his actions. They're even trying to block his suspension until a full investigation is completed." David's anger simmered, but he kept his voice calm. "And what about the past complaints against him? Those have to count for something?" "They do," Linda replied. "But the union is fighting every step of the way. They're claiming his past actions were misunderstandings. It's going to be an uphill battle." After the call, David sat down heavily, running a hand through his hair. He'd expected resistance, but hearing it laid out like this felt like a punch to the gut. He knew the system was slow to change, but he hadn't anticipated this level of pushback. When Maya joined him in the kitchen, he hesitated before telling her the news. He didn't want her to feel discouraged, but he believed she had the right to know. "They're trying to protect him," he said quietly, watching her reaction. "It won't be easy, but we're not giving up." Maya nodded, a steely determination in her eyes. "Then we keep going," she said. "We don't let them win." Meanwhile, Maya's story continued to spread, catching the attention of regional news stations. One evening, a major news outlet requested an interview with her and her family, wanting to cover the case and the impact it had on the community. David and Maya agreed, hoping that the wider exposure might add to the pressure for accountability. At the news studio, Maya sat under bright lights, feeling exposed but resolute. Beside her, David gave her a reassuring nod, his steady presence grounding her. The interviewer asked about the details of the incident, Maya's experience with the investigation, and the backlash they'd faced. Maya spoke honestly, her words measured and clear, as she described her experience and the toll it had taken on her. David spoke as well, his voice filled with a quiet but fierce conviction, calling for systemic change and accountability within the police force. "We're not just here for justice for my daughter," David said, looking directly into the camera. "We're here to ensure that no one else has to go through this. This is about creating a community where people can trust the officers sworn to protect them." As the interview ended, Maya felt a surge of relief. She had shared her story with the world, and she knew that her voice would continue to resonate beyond the walls of that studio. The following weeks were a whirlwind of support, backlash, and tireless advocacy. Community leaders rallied around the Fosters, organizing town hall meetings and working with local officials to propose new policies aimed at preventing abuse of power. Their efforts sparked fierce debates within the police department and the local government, but the calls for change only grew louder. One evening, as Maya and her family attended a town hall meeting, the mayor announced that the council was considering new policies for stricter guidelines on officer conduct, mandatory sensitivity training, and community oversight committees. Listening to the proposal, Maya felt a surge of hope. It was the beginning of the change they had fought so hard for, and she could see the difference her story had made. But the journey was far from over, and she knew there would still be obstacles ahead. After the meeting, community members approached her, thanking her for her courage and sharing their own stories. Some were tearful, others filled with gratitude and respect. Each person who came up to her reminded her of the importance of her fight. She was no longer just a victim. She was a symbol of resilience and a voice for change. Later that night, as Maya lay in bed, she felt the weight of everything she'd been through settle over her. She knew that there would always be those who doubted her, who tried to silence her. But as she thought of the people who had supported her, who had come forward to share their own experiences, she felt a renewed sense of strength. She wasn't alone in this fight. She had her family, her community, and a growing movement of people who believed in justice and accountability. As she drifted off to sleep, Maya's heart was filled with hope. The journey was just beginning, but she knew that together, they were unstoppable. The weeks leading up to the hearing were grueling for Maya and her family. They knew that the outcome of this investigation would impact not just Maya's life, but also the broader call for justice that had spread throughout the community. To prepare for the hearing, David met frequently with Detective Linda Carter, who guided them through every detail, ensuring Maya was ready for the challenges she would face. On the morning of the hearing, Maya felt a nervous energy building within her. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple sweater and jeans. Her father had told her that her strength and honesty were enough, that she didn't need to worry about appearances. Still, she felt the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on her shoulders. David sensed her anxiety and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Remember, Maya," he said gently, "all you need to do is tell the truth. Don't let them make you doubt yourself." Maya nodded, taking a deep breath. "I'll try, Dad," she replied, her voice wavering. They arrived at the courthouse early, flanked by family members and a few close friends who had come to show their support. Outside, reporters gathered, eager to capture every moment of the hearing that had gripped the community for weeks. David shielded Maya from the flashing cameras, guiding her inside with a calm but determined expression. Inside the courtroom, Maya sat beside her father, with Linda and her lawyer, Cynthia Reyes, on either side of them. The atmosphere was tense, and Maya felt her hands trembling. The police department officials were already there, seated at a long table across from them, with Officer Turner's lawyer and the union representative, Grant Walters, sitting stiffly at their side. As the hearing began, Cynthia introduced Maya's case with clarity and precision, detailing the events of that fateful day in the park and the misconduct that had followed. Her voice was steady and professional, each word carrying the weight of Maya's experience. But as soon as Cynthia finished, Grant Walters leaned forward, his expression cool and composed. "With all due respect, we need to examine the facts carefully before drawing conclusions," he began. "Officer Turner has been with the department for years, and he has a spotless record. It is only fair to question whether this is a simple misunderstanding." David clenched his fists, barely able to contain his frustration. He wanted to shout, to demand they take his daughter's words seriously, but he held his tongue, focusing on supporting Maya. The hearing proceeded with the department's representatives attempting to cast doubt on Maya's account. They argued that Officer Turner had been performing his duties and that Maya had likely misinterpreted his actions. But every time they tried to downplay the incident, Maya's resolve only strengthened. She knew what had happened. She remembered every painful detail. Finally, it was her turn to speak. She stood, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room on her, and took a deep breath. "On that day," Maya began, her voice trembling but clear, "I was just walking through the park. I didn't do anything to provoke Officer Turner. But he looked at me as if I'd done something wrong, as if I didn't belong there. When I tried to explain I was meeting my dad, he grabbed me, and he said awful things. He made me feel worthless. She paused, blinking back tears as she glanced at her father. David gave her an encouraging nod, silently urging her to continue. I didn't misunderstand anything, Maya continued, her voice growing stronger. He treated me like I was beneath him. He hurt me, and I want justice for that. I'm not lying. I want this to never happen to anyone else. When she finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. Her words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. She sat down, feeling a strange mix of relief and vulnerability as she awaited the response. The hearing then shifted to the evidence phase, with Linda presenting the past complaints filed against Turner. She detailed each incident, connecting the dots to show a pattern of behavior that couldn't be ignored. Some of the complaints were small, the kinds of incidents that might not stand out alone. But together, they painted a picture of someone who had repeatedly crossed lines. David watched as Turner's lawyer tried to downplay each incident, claiming they were isolated misunderstandings. But as Linda continued to build the case, he could see the confidence in Turner's expression begin to falter. The union representative exchanged worried glances with Turner, realizing that their narrative was losing ground. As Linda presented her final piece of evidence, she turned to the hearing officials and spoke with conviction. The truth is that Officer Turner's actions have caused real harm, not just to Maya, but to others in this community. The department must hold him accountable if it values the trust of the people it serves. When it was finally time for deliberation, the hearing officials left the room, leaving Maya, her family, and the department representatives in tense silence. David placed a comforting hand on Maya's shoulder, giving her a reassuring squeeze. "You did incredible, Maya," he whispered. "No matter what happens, I'm so proud of you." She managed a small smile, leaning into his embrace. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one stretching endlessly as they waited for the officials to return. After what felt like an eternity, the officials filed back in, their expressions neutral. The lead official, a woman with gray hair and a stern gaze, addressed the room. After careful consideration of the evidence and testimonies presented, she began, her voice firm. "We have concluded that there is sufficient cause for a full investigation into Officer Turner's conduct, both regarding the incident with Maya Foster and prior complaints filed against him. Effective immediately, Officer Turner will be placed on suspension pending the outcome of this investigation." A mixture of relief and exhaustion washed over Maya as she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. David wrapped his arm around her, his own sense of pride and gratitude reflected in his eyes. Turner's lawyer looked visibly shaken, and the union representative muttered something under his breath as they gathered their papers and left the room, their previous confidence nowhere in sight. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements, microphones and cameras aimed at Maya and her family. David, holding Maya protectively at his side, addressed the crowd with a clear, unwavering voice. "My daughter's bravery has exposed a painful truth about our community," he began. "This isn't just about one incident. It's about ensuring that every citizen can feel safe, respected, and valued. We will continue to fight for accountability and justice, and we urge everyone to join us in creating a better, more compassionate future." As the reporters continued to shout questions, Maya looked out at the crowd, feeling a newfound strength. This wasn't just her story anymore. It was part of a larger movement, a call for change that couldn't be ignored. That night, as they gathered at home, Maya felt a sense of peace she hadn't known since the day of the incident. The journey wasn't over, and there would still be battles to fight, but the suspension of Officer Turner felt like the first step toward real justice. David sat beside her, his arm wrapped around her shoulders. "We did it, Maya," he said quietly. "We took a step forward." Maya looked up at him, her eyes filled with determination. "I know, Dad, but this isn't the end. I want to make sure things really change." David nodded, his own resolve matching hers. "Then that's exactly what we'll do." They sat together in comfortable silence, their bond stronger than ever, knowing that they had turned their pain into a purpose that would ripple through their community for years to come. The days following the hearing felt like a whirlwind. The announcement of Officer Turner's suspension rippled through the town, igniting heated discussions in the community, the police department, and the city council. For many, Maya's story had become a powerful symbol of accountability and change. For others, especially those within the police union, it was an uncomfortable reckoning. With her father's support, Maya stepped further into the public eye, determined to keep the pressure on the department and ensure that Officer Turner's suspension wasn't the end of their fight. The outpouring of support gave her a renewed sense of purpose. People were looking to her not just for courage but for leadership, and she was ready to give them both. One Saturday afternoon, a rally was held at the town square, organized by local activists who wanted to support Maya and push for police reforms. Community members held signs reading, "Justice for all, end abuse of power," and "Protect our youth." The energy was electric, and as Maya stood at the edge of the crowd with her father, she felt an intense sense of belonging. These people had come together because of her, and she was deeply moved. A speaker approached the microphone, her voice strong as she addressed the crowd. "Maya Foster's bravery has reminded us of the work we still need to do," she said, her gaze sweeping across the sea of faces. "This isn't just about one officer or one incident. It's about creating a system that truly serves and protects all of us. We need better training, oversight, and transparency." As the crowd cheered, the speaker gestured for Maya to come forward. She felt her father's hand on her shoulder, giving her a gentle nudge. Taking a deep breath, Maya walked up to the microphone. Her voice shook slightly at first, but as she looked out at the supportive faces in the crowd, she found her strength. "I never wanted to be in this position," Maya began, her words steady and clear. "I just wanted to feel safe in my own community, in a place I've known my whole life. But after what happened to me, I realized that staying silent would only let things stay the same." She paused, gathering her thoughts as she looked at the faces watching her with admiration. "This fight isn't just for me. It's for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly, who's ever felt powerless. Together, we can make a difference. We can make sure that no one else has to feel the way I did that day." The crowd erupted into applause, and Maya felt a surge of pride as she stepped back from the microphone. Her father was waiting for her with a smile, his eyes shining with pride and encouragement. "Beautifully said, Maya," he whispered, wrapping her in a hug. As the rally continued, local leaders, students, parents, and concerned citizens took turns sharing their stories and calling for change. Many of them spoke about their experiences with unfair treatment, whether it was due to race, age, or social status. It was clear that Maya's story had tapped into a shared pain in the community, a desire for fairness and accountability that had long been suppressed. After the rally, Maya and her father spoke with the organizers and local activists who were planning the next steps. They wanted to draft a list of proposed changes for the police department, stricter guidelines on officer conduct, mandatory sensitivity and de-escalation training, and the formation of a community oversight committee to review misconduct cases. Maya, one of the organizers, Julia Reynolds, said as she handed her a flyer with a list of their demands, "I hope you know how much you've inspired everyone here. This movement wouldn't be happening without you." Maya nodded, humbled. "Thank you," she said softly, "but I couldn't do it without all of you. This is our fight, and we're stronger together." The impact of Maya's story extended beyond their town, catching the attention of nearby cities and even state officials. News outlets and radio shows discussed the case, often using it as an example of why police reform was urgently needed. Maya received messages from people across the state, other teenagers, parents, and even police officers who expressed their support. Some shared their own stories of mistreatment, and others simply thanked her for her courage. But not everyone was supportive. As the movement gained traction, there were those who pushed back. A few police officers and union representatives publicly defended Turner, calling his suspension unfair and politically motivated. Others dismissed Maya's account as exaggerated, suggesting she was influenced by the media or even her father's position as a police captain. The backlash hit Maya hard. One evening, she overheard her father talking on the phone, his voice filled with frustration as he spoke to a colleague who was defending Turner. "They're trying to protect him, David," the voice on the other end of the line said. "Some people think he's being made an example of, and they're not happy about it." David sighed, his voice filled with barely controlled anger. An example? This isn't just about Turner. This is about a culture that's been allowed to go unchecked for too long. Maya deserves justice. They can't ignore that. Maya's heart sank as she listened, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. She knew that change would be difficult, but hearing her father's frustration reminded her of the deep resistance they were up against. Despite the pushback, Maya and her father pressed on. They attended city council meetings, spoke at local schools, and met with community leaders who were determined to push for reform. At one city council meeting, the mayor announced that they would be proposing a new policy package aimed at addressing the issues raised by Maya's case. The package included a community oversight board, regular training on sensitivity and de-escalation, and a new system for handling misconduct complaints within the department. Maya felt a glimmer of hope as she listened to the announcement. It was a sign that their efforts were paying off, that their voices were finally being heard. But the mayor's words were met with mixed reactions. Some council members expressed support, while others voiced concerns about the cost and feasibility of the new policies. After the meeting, a group of supporters gathered outside, their faces filled with determination and hope. Maya and her father joined them, and one by one, people began to speak, sharing their thoughts on the proposed changes and what they hoped would come next. In the following weeks, Maya continued to speak out, her voice growing stronger with each appearance. She spoke at more rallies, met with community leaders, and participated in forums where she shared her experience and her vision for a safer, more accountable community. Her story became a rallying cry, inspiring others to come forward and push for changes in their own communities. As the movement continued to grow, Maya and her father found themselves at the forefront of a battle that was far bigger than they had ever anticipated. They were fighting not just for justice in her case, but for a system that would protect everyone, a system that treated every citizen with respect and dignity. One evening, as they sat together in their living room, David looked at his daughter, his heart filled with pride and admiration. "You know, Maya," he said softly, "you're stronger than I ever could have imagined. I never wanted you to go through this, but you've turned something terrible into something powerful." Maya smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I learned it from you, Dad," she replied. "You always taught me to stand up for what's right, no matter how hard it is." They sat together in comfortable silence, both of them reflecting on how much had changed since that day in the park. They had faced challenges, fears, and doubts, but through it all, they had found a strength they hadn't known existed. In the months that followed, the police department began implementing some of the proposed changes. Officers were required to attend regular sensitivity training, the Community Oversight Board was established, and a new system was put in place for handling complaints against officers. The process was slow, and resistance remained, but the seeds of change had been planted. Maya continued to be a voice for the movement, her story inspiring people in ways she could never have anticipated. She met with other young activists, attended workshops, and even began volunteering with a local organization dedicated to advocating for police reform. The journey was far from over, and Maya knew there would still be battles to fight. But as she looked back on everything she had endured, she felt a deep sense of pride and purpose. She had transformed her pain into a force for good, and she was determined to keep pushing forward. One day, as she stood in front of a crowd at another rally, she looked out at the sea of faces and felt a surge of gratitude. She wasn't alone. She had a community behind her, a father who believed in her, and a future that she was determined to make brighter. With a steady voice and unwavering resolve, Maya began to speak, her words echoing through the crowd as a call to action, a promise of change, and a reminder that they were all part of something bigger. Together, they would build a world where everyone felt safe, respected, and valued. And in that moment, Maya knew they were unstoppable. The proposed changes for police reform, sparked by Maya's case, continued to stir conversations and controversy throughout the community. The list of reforms, which included a community oversight board, mandatory training on de-escalation and sensitivity, and transparent reporting for misconduct, was debated at every level of the city's administration. Despite facing resistance from some council members and pushback from the police union, the pressure from the public, led in part by Maya and her father, David, kept the conversation alive. One crisp autumn evening, Maya, David, and Sarah attended a city council meeting where the final vote on the reform package was set to take place. The council chamber was packed, standing room only, with community members, reporters, and supporters. Some wore buttons that read, "Justice for All," and held up signs urging the council to pass the reforms. Maya's heart pounded as she took in the scene, realizing that the movement she had helped spark had grown far beyond her own experience. The council members took their seats, and the mayor, a tall, stoic woman named Elaine Richards, addressed the room. "Tonight's discussion and vote will impact our community's future," she said, her voice firm yet respectful. "The recent events surrounding Maya Foster's case have opened our eyes to issues within our law enforcement that must be addressed. We have the opportunity to create a safer, more accountable community." As the council discussed the proposed policies, Maya's nerves grew. Some council members voiced their full support, speaking to the necessity of accountability and their commitment to public safety. But others expressed hesitation, voicing concerns about the cost, the potential strain on police resources, and the pushback from the police union. "These changes are extreme and rushed," argued Councilman Jeffrey Morgan, a staunch supporter of the police union. "I believe in accountability, but we can't strip our officers of their ability to do their jobs." David clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he listened to the debate. He felt a surge of frustration at the resistance, but he knew that they couldn't give up now. He leaned over and whispered to Maya, "No matter what they say, we've made them listen. We've come this far." Maya nodded, her resolve hardening as the discussion continued. Finally, the mayor opened the floor to community members, inviting them to speak briefly before the vote. One by one, people stood, sharing their support for the reforms and expressing their hopes for a safer, more just community. Some parents spoke about their fear for their children, others shared personal stories of unfair treatment by law enforcement, and a few younger people even credited Maya's bravery for inspiring them to speak out. When it was Maya's turn, she stood up and walked to the podium, her heart beating fast. She took a moment to look out over the audience, then glanced back at her father, who gave her a reassuring nod. "I never wanted to be here," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I didn't want to be someone who had to speak up about something so painful. But after what happened to me, I realized that I couldn't stay silent. I'm not just here for myself. I'm here for everyone who has ever felt powerless or afraid when they shouldn't have to be." Maya's voice grew stronger as she continued. "These reforms are about creating a community that values respect and justice, a place where people can trust those who were sworn to protect them. We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for basic human decency and fairness." She took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with determination. "Please, don't ignore this chance to make things right." The audience erupted in applause as Maya returned to her seat, and David wrapped his arm around her shoulders, whispering, "You did beautifully, Maya." The vote was close. The council members cast their votes one by one, and Maya's heart raced with each name called. When the last vote was tallied, Mayor Richards announced the result. The reform package had passed by a narrow margin. Cheers and applause filled the chamber, and Maya felt an overwhelming surge of relief and pride. The reforms were not just a victory for her, but for everyone who had supported her, who had come together to demand accountability and respect. As the crowd filtered out of the council chamber, people approached Maya and her family, expressing their gratitude and admiration. Some were community leaders, others were parents, and a few were fellow students who thanked her for her courage. Maya felt a deep sense of connection to each person who reached out, knowing that their voices had helped make this change possible. In the days that followed, the department began preparing to implement the new policies. Officers were scheduled to attend training sessions, the Community Oversight Board was established, and the reporting system for misconduct was overhauled. There was still resistance from some within the police force, but the department's leadership was determined to uphold the new standards, seeing them as a way to rebuild trust with the community. Meanwhile, Maya's life began to return to a semblance of normalcy. She returned to school, reconnected with friends, and even joined the debate club, feeling that her newfound confidence could help her make a difference in other areas as well. Her experience had changed her, giving her a strength and purpose she hadn't known before. But despite the progress, the journey was far from over. The backlash persisted, with some members of the police union, continuing to push back against the changes. Maya overheard her father talking late one night, his voice filled with frustration as he discussed the union's latest attempts to block Turner's dismissal. "They're acting like this is just a bad day or a mistake," he told a colleague. "But Turner's behavior goes beyond one incident. He's harmed people, intentionally, and he needs to face the consequences." Maya felt a pang of anger and sadness as she listened. She knew that real change was slow and often met with resistance. But she also knew that they couldn't afford to give up, that too much was at stake. In the months that followed, the community began to see the impact of the reforms. Incidents of misconduct were reported more transparently, and the Oversight Board took each case seriously, ensuring that complaints were addressed. Officers who had once been dismissive of community members' concerns now listened, knowing that they were accountable not just to their department, but to the people they served. One afternoon, Maya received a letter in the mail from a family in a nearby city. Their daughter had experienced bullying and harassment from someone in authority, and they thanked Maya for her courage, saying that her story had inspired them to speak out and fight for justice in their own community. The letter filled her with pride, a reminder of how far-reaching her impact had become. "You're making a difference, Maya," her mother said, reading the letter with tears in her eyes. "I know this hasn't been easy, but look at the lives you're touching." Maya nodded, feeling a sense of fulfillment that went beyond words. She had turned her pain into a source of strength, something that could help others, something that mattered. That spring, the city held a special event to recognize Maya's contribution to the community. The mayor presented her with an award for her courage and resilience, thanking her for sparking a movement that would benefit future generations. Maya accepted the award with humility, knowing that she was just one part of a larger story, a story written by the countless voices who had joined her. As she looked out over the audience, Maya felt a deep sense of peace. She saw her parents in the crowd, their faces beaming with pride. She saw friends, classmates, and community members who had stood by her, who had shown her that she was never alone. In that moment, Maya knew that the fight for justice and respect would continue, that each person in that room would carry the torch forward, pushing for a fairer, more compassionate world. The changes they had achieved were only the beginning, but Maya felt ready for whatever lay ahead. She had found her voice, and she had used it to stand up for herself and for others. And in doing so, she had created something lasting, something powerful, a legacy of courage and hope. As she left the event that evening, Maya looked up at the night sky, feeling the cool air on her face. She took a deep breath, a sense of calm settling over her. She had faced darkness, fear, and pain, but she had emerged stronger, with a renewed purpose. Her journey wasn't over, but she was ready to face whatever came next. With her family, her community, and her own inner strength to guide her, Maya knew that she was part of something greater, a movement for justice that would continue to grow, one voice at a time. The proposed changes for police reform, sparked by Maya's case, continued to stir conversations and controversy throughout the community. The list of reforms, which included a community oversight board, mandatory training on de-escalation and sensitivity, and transparent reporting for misconduct, was debated at every level of the city's administration. Despite facing resistance from some council members and pushback from the police union, the pressure from the public, led in part by Maya and her father, David, kept the conversation alive. One crisp autumn evening, Maya, David, and Sarah attended a city council meeting where the final vote on the reform package was set to take place. The council chamber was packed, standing room only, with community members, reporters, and supporters. Some wore buttons that read, "Justice for All," and held up signs urging the council to pass the reforms. Maya's heart pounded as she took in the scene, realizing that the movement she had helped spark had grown far beyond her own experience. The council members took their seats, and the mayor, a tall, stoic woman named Elaine Richards, addressed the room. "Tonight's discussion and vote will impact our community's future," she said, her voice firm yet respectful. "The recent events surrounding Maya Foster's case have opened our eyes to issues within our law enforcement that must be addressed. We have the opportunity to create a safer, more accountable community." As the council discussed the proposed policies, Maya's nerves grew. Some council members voiced their full support, speaking to the necessity of accountability and their commitment to public safety. But others expressed hesitation, voicing concerns about the cost, the potential strain on police resources, and the pushback from the police union. These changes are extreme and rushed, argued Councilman Jeffrey Morgan, a staunch supporter of the police union. I believe in accountability, but we can't strip our officers of their ability to do their jobs. David clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he listened to the debate. He felt a surge of frustration at the resistance, but he knew that they couldn't give up now. He leaned over and whispered to Maya, "No matter what they say, we've made them listen. We've come this far." Maya nodded, her resolve hardening as the discussion continued. Finally, the mayor opened the floor to community members, inviting them to speak briefly before the vote. One by one, people stood, sharing their support for the reforms and expressing their hopes for a safer, more just community. Some parents spoke about their fear for their children, others shared personal stories of unfair treatment by law enforcement, and a few younger people even credited Maya's bravery for inspiring them to speak out. When it was Maya's turn, she stood up and walked to the podium, her heart beating fast. She took a moment to look out over the audience, then glanced back at her father, who gave her a reassuring nod. "I never wanted to be here," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I didn't want to be someone who had to speak up about something so painful. But after what happened to me, I realized that I couldn't stay silent. I'm not just here for myself. I'm here for everyone who has ever felt powerless or afraid when they shouldn't have to be." Maya's voice grew stronger as she continued. "These reforms are about creating a community that values respect and justice, a place where people can trust those who are sworn to protect them. We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for basic human decency and fairness." She took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with determination. "Please, don't ignore this chance to make things right." The audience erupted in applause as Maya returned to her seat, and David wrapped his arm around her shoulders, whispering, "You did beautifully, Maya." The vote was close. The council members cast their votes one by one, and Maya's heart raced with each name called. When the last vote was tallied, Mayor Richards announced the result. The reform package had passed by a narrow margin. Cheers and applause filled the chamber, and Maya felt an overwhelming surge of relief and pride. The reforms were not just a victory for her, but for everyone who had supported her, who had come together to demand accountability and respect. As the crowd filtered out of the council chamber, people approached Maya and her family, expressing their gratitude and admiration. Some were community leaders, others were parents, and a few were fellow students who thanked her for her courage. Maya felt a deep sense of connection to each person who reached out, knowing that their voices had helped make this change possible. In the days that followed, the department began preparing to implement the new policies. Officers were scheduled to attend training sessions, the Community Oversight Board was established, and the reporting system for misconduct was overhauled. There was still resistance from some within the police force, but the department's leadership was determined to uphold the new standards, seeing them as a way to rebuild trust with the community. Meanwhile, Maya's life began to return to a semblance of normalcy. She returned to school, reconnected with friends, and even joined the debate club, feeling that her newfound confidence could help her make a difference in other areas as well. Her experience had changed her, giving her a strength and purpose she hadn't known before. But despite the progress, the journey was far from over. The backlash persisted, with some members of the police union continuing to push back against the changes. Maya overheard her father talking late one night, his voice filled with frustration as he discussed the union's latest attempts to block Turner's dismissal. "They're acting like this is just a bad day, or a mistake," he told a colleague. "But Turner's behavior goes beyond one incident. He's harmed people, intentionally, and he needs to face the consequences." Maya felt a pang of anger and sadness as she listened. She knew that real change was slow and often met with resistance. But she also knew that they couldn't afford to give up, that too much was at stake. In the months that followed, the community began to see the impact of the reforms. Incidents of misconduct were reported more transparently, and the Oversight Board took each case seriously, ensuring that complaints were addressed. Officers who had once been dismissive of community members' concerns now listened, knowing that they were accountable not just to their department, but to the people they served. One afternoon, Maya received a letter in the mail from a family in a nearby city. Their daughter had experienced bullying and harassment from someone in authority, and they thanked Maya for her courage, saying that her story had inspired them to speak out and fight for justice in their own community. The letter filled her with pride, a reminder of how far-reaching her impact had become. "You're making a difference, Maya," her mother said, reading the letter with tears in her eyes. "I know this hasn't been easy, but look at the lives you're touching." Maya nodded, feeling a sense of fulfillment that went beyond words. She had turned her pain into a source of strength, something that could help others, something that mattered. That spring, the city held a special event to recognize Maya's contribution to the community. The mayor presented her with an award for her courage and resilience, thanking her for sparking a movement that would benefit future generations. Maya accepted the award with humility, knowing that she was just one part of a larger story, a story written by the countless voices who had joined her. As she looked out over the audience, Maya felt a deep sense of peace. She saw her parents in the crowd, their faces beaming with pride. She saw friends, classmates, and community members who had stood by her, who had shown her that she was never alone. In that moment, Maya knew that the fight for justice and respect would continue, that each person in that room would carry the torch forward, pushing for a fairer, more compassionate world. The changes they had achieved were only the beginning, but Maya felt ready for whatever lay ahead. She had found her voice, and she had used it to stand up for herself and for others. And in doing so, she had created something lasting, something powerful, a legacy of courage and hope. As she left the event that evening, Maya looked up at the night sky, feeling the cool air on her face. She took a deep breath, a sense of calm settling over her. She had faced darkness, fear, and pain, but she had emerged stronger, with a renewed purpose. Her journey wasn't over, but she was ready to face whatever came next. With her family, her community, and her own inner strength to guide her, Maya knew that she was part of something greater, a movement for justice that would continue to grow, one voice at a time.